So as men move into their careers, how might responsibility and purpose be conceptualized? Well, look, so I always start from the fundamental observation that life is characterized by a fair bit of suffering. There's a tragic element to life, tragedy tainted by malevolence. And what that poses a problem, and the problem is, well, what can sustain you through suffering and tragedy, betrayal and illness, death, loss, disappointment, frustration, confusion. And it's not hedonism. It's not happiness, not if you conceptualize happiness in this narrowly pleasure-seeking hedonic way. First of all, that doesn't iterate very well. You know, you can drink 26 of vodka one night, and that might be a pretty fun night, but you know the next 2 or 3 days are not going to be so pleasant, and you'll probably do at least 5 things that you seriously regret, assuming you can remember what they are. So it's not a great strategy, and everyone knows that you know, that casual, impulsive pleasure-seeking is not, it's not a good game. Everyone knows that. And that doesn't mean you should be afraid to try it, right? That's entirely different. You need to bash yourself around a bit. What did William Blake say? Wisdom through excess. There's definitely something to that. So, you know, walling yourself away from experimentation, that's not a good idea. But falling prey to indulgences, that's a catastrophe. So you can't find, and then if your life is proceeding in a direction that's painful and tragic for reasons that might be really out of your control, obviously you're not going to be happy during those times. You may not have even the opportunity to seek anything that's pleasurable or the ability to experience it. So then what's going to sustain you under those circumstances and sustain your will to live, but even more importantly, protect you from the resentment and the moral corruption that unrequited suffering can so easily produce? And the answer to that is not happiness, but something like meaning. And then you might ask yourself, well, where is meaning to be found? And the answer seems to be primarily through the voluntary adoption of responsibility. You know, so people find meaning in the love they have for their partner and their decision to care for someone else as well or better than they would care for themselves. They find meaning in that, and it can sustain itself across many, many decades, for better or for worse. That's no joke, that phrase. They find meaning in the relationship they establish with their children, assuming they take the responsibility for that relationship. They find meaning in their friendships. They find meaning in their business associations, their civic engagement. You know, people moralize at, older people moralize at younger people and say, well, you should accept your responsibility, you should shoulder your duty. And that's true, but it isn't exactly that you should do it because you should do it, even though you should. It's that there isn't anything better that you can possibly do. Like, you have to justify yourself to yourself. You have to justify yourself to yourself because of your inadequacies and your failure and your error and your propensity to repeat errors that you know you shouldn't repeat, your sinful nature. You have to atone for that. And then you have to justify your life to yourself because it's characterized by death and suffering. And so you need something worthwhile to do. And, well, then you might say, well, there's nothing worthwhile to do. It's, well, you're probably not really in any position to make that judgment, you know, until you've gone all in at least one thing. At least one thing. Because, like, who the hell are you? You're 16, you're cynical and nihilistic. It's like, you're not wise. You're not a philosopher. You don't know anything. And thank God, right? Because you don't even want to think you know anything because you're bloody miserable and you're suffering. And so if you're also right, well, then you're doomed. So you better bloody well pray that your cynicism and nihilism, unearned though it may be, is based on a fundamental falsehood. And it is. You can find deep significance in your life, and you find it essentially through the decision to voluntarily bear your suffering and to trudge uphill nonetheless. And there's something heroic about that in the most fundamental sense. And that heroism is something so deeply meaningful that it, in some sense, triumphs over even death. And so, as you move forward through life, you mature, you start by developing responsibility for yourself, your friends, your roommates, then you take on a partner, and you have a family, and you expand the domain of responsibility and generosity, and you want to expand that. Who knows how much you can expand that? You know, you could be a credit to the nation. Well, there's an aim. Why don't you aim to be like credit to the nation by the time you're 50? Because what you got something better to do than that? And the answer to that's no. And you know, what are you going to do? You're going to pursue endless one-night stands. You're going to bury yourself nose deep in cocaine. You're going to become an alcoholic. You're going to pursue that tinsely, trashy hedonism that is nothing but destructive and generates nothing but self-contempt, and then bitterness, then misery, then vengefulness. It's like, that's why do that? I mean, it's easier in some sense, right? Although it's not, because it's rife with catastrophe and suffering. So it's way better to envision yourself as, that's the cross image fundamentally, right? The pathway to redemption is to bear your cross up the hill voluntarily. It's a hell of a thing to ask, right? Because you have to accept the fundamental limits of your mortal vulnerability. And you have to say to yourself, I will do good nonetheless. Right? And that's not obedience. That's not naivete. That's a cold decision, man. So everyone great makes that decision. So make that decision, because maybe you're great. If you're going to be a fighter, you have to want to win. And you have to want to hurt people. I mean, not for the sake of hurting them. That's what makes you different than an evil person. But you have to have that capacity. You have to develop that. And, you know, that's the step on the way to enlightenment, weirdly enough, because that isn't what people think.
People have been fed this diet of pablum, rights and impulsive freedom, for so long. There's just an absolute starvation for the other side of the story. There are no rights, technically speaking, without responsibilities. And all we've had for 60 years is a dialogue about rights. Well, that leaves a hole on the other side of the story. And it's a hole that's in people's hearts, essentially. Because responsibility, well, perhaps that's not more important than rights. Like I said, they're part and parcel of the same formula. But it's in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life. It's not in happiness. It's not an impulsive pleasure. Those things blow away at the first ill wind. But to adopt the responsibility for your own well-being, and to try to put your family together, and to try to serve your community, and to try to seek for eternal truths and to live them, that's the sort of thing that can ground you in your life enough so that you can withstand the difficulty of life. And when you tell people that, especially when you include yourself in the audience, let's say, and you're not finger waving from above, then everyone knows that it's true. There's been this attempt to identify masculine competence and power, let's say, but mostly competence with tyranny, and that's very, very hard on young men. It's also hard on young women, for that matter, but it's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world, because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak. And life is a very difficult process, and you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like, those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order, right? And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea, because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous. You don't treat adult men as if they're infants.
It doesn't matter what your personal circumstances are. There's always something that isn't right near you, isn't correct, isn't laid out properly. that you could just fix if you wanted to. There's no shortage of opportunities to do that. You can do that in your own mind. You can do that in your own room. You can do that in your own household, in your local community. And maybe if you get good at doing it at all those levels, then you can start to look beyond that. If you adopt an attitude that the role that you should play is to make things better wherever you are, however you can, that what would actually happen would be that things would get better wherever you are. The world shifts itself around your aim, because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. So that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim. And then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems. And if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim. And you can concentrate on the day. And so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. An uphill trajectory is actually even better than being somewhere good, as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that really makes your life meaningful is the clear realization that you're headed somewhere better than you are now. And then it's even better if you also understand that there's a direct causal relationship between the things that you're doing and the steepness of that incline. There's two modes of being in the world, right? There's one where you adopt the responsibility for living properly, for being properly, and you make the sacrifices necessary for doing that, and then everything will flourish properly. And the other one is a pathway of resentment and bitterness and rejection and genocide. If you make your life 0.1% better a week, man, in 2 or 3 years, you're in such a better place than you were that it isn't even like the same domain. And if you keep that up for 10 years or 20 years, especially if you're young and you start early, you start to straighten yourself out and fix the things that you can fix. You can transform your lives in ways that are completely unimaginable. And God only knows what the upper limit of that is in terms of human possibility. What you're actually made of, what you're made of is what you encounter when you voluntarily encounter the unknown. And so the more you voluntarily encounter the unknown, the more you get made of. And the more you get made of, the more there is to you. And then the more you're good at encountering the unknown and restructuring order and calling forth proper order out of the potential of being. And God, you got to think, why wouldn't you do that since you can do that? The fact that you're fragile is actually a precondition for your heroism, because if you weren't fragile, then there'd be nothing heroic about doing something difficult, right? Because if you couldn't be hurt or damaged or defeated or end up in failure, then where's the moral courage in the endeavor? It has to be that the fragility is built into the courage. People denigrate the opportunities that are right in front of them. And there's no reason to do that, because what's right in front of you is the majesty of being. That's what's right in front of you. It's inexhaustibly complex and full of potential, and there's no reason to assume that wherever you happen to be isn't as good a starting place as anywhere else. Well, I know some people have terrible, terrible lives. They're in situations that are absolutely unbearable. But I also do know that even situations like that can be made a hell of a lot worse by the worst kind of attitude. That's for sure. Imagine someone that you treat well, that you love. Then try to treat yourself that way. You got to detach from yourself a bit. You got to think, okay, well, I'm a person among other people, and I deserve at least as much respect as a person among other people, and I should be trying to help myself across time. And instead of being self-contemptuous and self-destructive, I need to take care of myself as if I'm potentially valuable, and to lay out my life that way. And so that's what that chapter is about. And it's hard for people. They don't take care of themselves as well as they should. And I don't mean, take care of yourself. I mean, that isn't what I mean. It's like, it's not a moralistic attack. It's an encouragement to give yourself a bit of the benefit of the doubt. Take care of your room, take care of your things, have some respect for yourself, it's like there is a lot of potential within you, and there's many things that you can do, and you're necessary more than you think to the unfolding of things. Like if you make a bunch of bad decisions, things get worse, not just for you, like things get worse. And so it matters what you do. And so part of what you do is you want to treat yourself as if what you do matters. And so you want to have some respect for yourself. One of the things Solzhenitsyn said about hedonism, he said, the doctrine that life is for happiness is invalidated by the first sound of the jackboots kicking in your door. And so then the question is, well, what do you do in the face of suffering when your philosophy is hedonic, is hedonistic? And the answer is collapse. And that means that happiness as an aim is shallow and weak. It cannot withstand suffering. Obviously, because when you're suffering, you're not happy. And if the purpose of life is to be happy, then when you're suffering, your life has no meaning. And then if you're suffering and there's no meaning in the suffering, then you're really suffering. That's really hell. But then you think, and this is something that's really heartened me. I talk to my audiences, especially to the young men. I say, look, first of all, don't aim at being happy, because that's just not going to work, especially when the storms come and barbarians are beating at the gate. You can just forget about that. And there's going to be times in your life where you're suffering so much you can't believe it. And so you're going to need something a hell of a lot more robust than happiness to get you through that. And then you might say, well, what's more robust than happiness? Or maybe even what's more robust than pain? And then you could say, well, how about adventure? How about adventure? How about we go out and sail the uncharted seas, you know? How about we go and, Jesus, I talked to a guy the other day. He's a driver for me down in Nashville, where I am, ex-military guy, special forces guy, tough as a bloody boot, now works as a cowboy out in Montana, you know, a real character, perfect bloody American archetype. He knew he wanted to be in the special forces when he was 5. So I talked to him for like half an hour trying to figure out what motivated him, you know? And he told me probably 10 stories about his life, all very colorful and deep anecdotes, battle and rescue and physical privation and discipline. And every 10 minutes he said, I was looking for a new challenge. And then I was looking for a new challenge. And then I'd already done that, so I was looking for a new challenge. And for him, life was nothing but a sequence of impossible mountains to climb. And that's exactly what he wanted. And that's what I think we all want. You know, in the story of Abraham, when Abraham is perfectly happy in his father's tent, eating peeled grapes and, you know, having his diapers changed, even though he's 80 years old. And God calls him out to adventure. And it's very catastrophic, right? Because Abraham encounters tyranny and starvation and war and conspiracy to steal his wife and his own proclivity to lie cowardly. And this is all like that's his first sequence of adventures. And you think, well, what the hell's going on here? It's certainly not the case that God called him out to be happy. And I think the right moral to draw from that story is that God, so to speak, has called us out for something far greater than mere happiness. So much greater than happiness that happiness pales in comparison. He's called us out for the adventure of our life that's of sufficient moral integrity to justify the suffering. And that's something. And if you tell people that, if you let them know that, you know, well, that makes them stand up and cheer, eh? Because deep in their heart, they know that's true. They're hearing that spirit of adventure calls you to be a patriarchal despoiler of the planet. And that demoralizes young men. And that's, of course, exactly the point, because demoralized young men aren't oppressors, although, yes, they are. And they're not despoilers of the planet, although, yes, they are. And so happiness, it's like, you know, that's just, happiness is a side effect of moral venture, you know, and if it comes along, you should be bloody thrilled. But as an aim, it's for narcissistic 3-year-olds as an aim. It's funny that philosopher Kierkegaard, you don't usually hear a joke that starts like that, by the way. He wrote 150 years ago, and he was one of the first people who really wrote about anxiety. He was one of the first psychological philosophers. And he regarded himself as rather useless, all things considered. And he wrote a section in one of his books about all the industrialists that were operating in Europe at that time, trying in every possible way to make life easier and easier and more efficient and productive for everyone, which was definitely happening during the Victorian period, and Europe was rapidly transforming into an industrial powerhouse. And he said, someone as useless as him, with an orientation towards being a student who liked to sit and contemplate ideas and talk in cafes and smoke cigars and drink, could never do anything to make anything easier for anyone than everyone was already trying to make it. And so he thought that his task would be to make things more difficult for people, because there would come a time when what people wanted wasn't more ease, but more challenge and more difficulty. And that's really smart, you know, and it's witty and it's true. And one of the things that I've come to understand, I believe, is that, and Dostoevsky knew this too. He wrote about this in Notes from Underground. It's a great book, very short book, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, compelling, dark read. It's the confession of a miserable, resentful, like murderously genocidal bureaucrat who evaluates his own soul, I suppose, and confesses his sins. And it's also a critique of the idea of kind of utopia oriented towards security. And Dostoevsky, who was dealing with the set of ideas that are really tearing us apart culturally right now, this idea of a eventual utopia based on something like security and safety. Dostoevsky really objected to that back in this, like 1860, a long time ago. He said, you know, the thing about people that you don't really understand is that, he said, fundamentally we're ungrateful and we can curse. That's what distinguished us from the animals, which I thought was pretty damn comical. But he said something very interesting, you know. He said, if you set up a utopia so that all people had to do was eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, that, yeah, right, Russian humor, you know, that after a surfeit of that, after enough of that, which would happen quite quickly, people would just go mad just to break things, just so something unexpected and remarkable could happen, and that we're not built for security and safety, but for something, well, let's call it adventure, something like adventure. That's a good thing to know, you know, because you don't want to suffer unduly. That seems reasonable. And you might think, because of that, that really what you want is happiness. But then Solzhenitsyn, for example, he wrote about what happened in the Gulag Archipelago under Stalin and said, you know, if your goal is happiness, what are you going to do when the jackboots hammer down your door at 2 a.m. and haul you off to the prison camp, because you're not going to be happy there. And so, you know, happiness is a boat that's easily capsized and the waves are always there. And so if your philosophy is one of, say, impulsive happiness, same sort of thing Dostoevsky was pointing at, and Kierkegaard, then you're not prepared when all hell breaks loose. And all hell, it will absolutely 100% break through at some point in your life. And you're lucky if it won't be decades, you know, it'll certainly be some of it, and it might be a lot of it. And for some of you, it's going to be damn near the whole thing. And so if what floats your boat is happiness, you're going to be capsized by the first decent wave. And so then you might ask yourself, you know, what do you have instead of happiness that might be even more reliable? And I do think that adventure is more reliable than happiness. And in the Old Testament story of Abraham, founder of the Abrahamic faiths, and obviously what would you call it, a crucial figure in the development of world culture, Abraham is presented as a late bloomer, to say the least. He's like 83. People lived longer back then, at least so the story goes. And he had a very rich father by nomadic standards, and he could just sit around in the tent all day. And, you know, a doting mother and a rich father, he could just sit around in the tent all day and eat peeled grapes and busy himself with the continuation of the species. And But, God appears to him and says, get away, get out of your security, get out of your comfort. Leave your family, leave your community, leave your nation, go out into the world. And it's very interesting. It's a very interesting story. It's very interesting to contemplate it from both a psychological and a religious perspective, because what God is presented as in that book, which is a crucial book as I said, for world culture, is God is presented as the manifestation of the Spirit that calls even the too secure and pampered to adventure. And then Abraham has a pretty rough time when he goes out and has his adventure. It's not all, Skittles and roses from then on in. Quite the contrary. And he runs right away into like a conspiracy of elites to steal his wife. He runs into tyranny, runs into starvation. He encounters war. It's like he goes out in the world and he has the whole tragedy of his life, both on the social and political front and individually, But the promise is the promise of adventure, and the implication is that if you have a sufficient adventure, then that cannot so much protect you from suffering, because perhaps that is impossible, but to justify it. And because you kind of know this in your own life. When you look at your life, you might look back on travails that you've undertaken, and they've done end-of-life surveys with people and asked them what they regret. And, people don't regret what they did that didn't work. They regret what they didn't do that could have worked. They regret the chances they didn't take. And, even if you do an evaluation of your biography, one of the things that you want to be able to say to yourself is something like, maybe there's nothing better you can say to yourself than this. You can think about this for yourself and see if it's true. That was extraordinarily difficult, but it was worth it. And, it's not like you can have one of those without the other, because you can't imagine that you could have some confidence in what you've managed to accomplish, right? The kind of confidence that would instill you with a certain genuine sense of self-regard despite your fundamental inadequacy. To have that fundamental sense of self-regard that's grounded in something real, it has to be based in a narrative that approximates that was extremely difficult, but it was worth it. You have to have both of those. And so that's interesting, because one of the questions we always ask ourselves, this is the theodicy question, technically. You see the suffering in the world, you see the suffering of children, you see maybe your own children or your suffering, and you wonder, well, how can reality be constituted so that I can have faith in its essence when there is so much suffering? And one answer to that is something like, well, how much suffering do you want? And you might think, none. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. At least you want something approximating optimized challenge. So you could say, at least you want to be pushed to your limit. And maybe you find the most exciting times in your life. In fact, you'll pay for this. You'll pay to have this experience, to be pushed to your limit. Not beyond it, or maybe even a bit beyond it, And maybe not so far beyond it that you crumble and break and things fall apart. But, could you be pushed to your limit optimally if there wasn't the possibility of falling apart and breaking? That's an open question. How are you ever going to take something seriously if the consequences aren't actually serious? And there's something delightful about dancing on the edge. That's why Hawaiians believed that surfing was sacred, And it's because to surf, you have to be on the edge, right? And the waves can come and take you out at any moment. But without the possibility of the waves rising to take you out, then you can't dance on the edge. And maybe that's exactly what you want to do. And there's good evidence from the neuroscience literature that consciousness itself is something akin to dancing on the edge. So technically, when you're conscious, when you're awake, your brain is occupying a position between something. It's a position that's something like between chaos and order. And if your brain's maximally ordered, well, you're just bored, nothing is changing. And if you're chaotic, then it's anxiety and catastrophe. But you want to be positioned right between those two, and that's when your consciousness is optimized, And when your consciousness is optimized, then you're deeply engaged in life, and everything seems alive and meaningful. And maybe that's the solution in some profound sense to the problem of suffering. It's that you optimize your interaction with chaos rather than being protected all the time from everything that could hurt you. And you kind of know this too if you have kids, because you don't want to keep your kids in an infantile state, and because when they're infants, pretty much what you do with them, say they're 6 months and younger, is you just keep them secure and safe, right? You just provide everything that you can for them. You have to do that because, well, what are they going to do? They just lay there fundamentally and squawk now and then. I mean, it's not like they're ambulatory. They can't go out and do things for themselves, and so it's up to you, and your goal is to keep them secure and safe. But once they start being able to move around, then increasingly it's sort of up to them. And if you have any sense as a parent, the psychoanalysts used to say, the good mother necessarily fails. And what did they mean by that? They meant, well, you know, if you're committed to your infant when you're a mother for the first 6 months, it's like it's all the kid, 100%, full self-sacrifice devoted towards the infant. That's the right attitude. But even by 9 months, child can crawl around quite a lot. They're developing something of an independent will. You start handing them challenges. You start handing them responsibility, and you keep them on the edge. And some of your kids are going to be able to be pushed harder than others, and part of the reason you have to develop a relationship with your kids, and your husband for that matter, is so that, you know, you can keep them dancing on the edge, on the proper edge. And that's even better than the mere provision of security. What sort of life would you have to have so that you could bear your suffering nobly? That's a good question to ask yourself. Now, and so we had people just write for 15 minutes. If you could have what you wanted and needed, what might that look like? And there's an instruction there too, is do it badly. Because what the hell do you know? And besides, your vision's going to change as you progress through your life. And so you're not going to get it done perfectly, but that's okay. Get it down. Get a rough first draft down, right? A rough approximation of who you could be if you got your act together. And not who other people think you should be, you know? Although that might enter into it because you don't want to be completely you can't be who you are properly and ignore the fact that you're embedded in a social context. And so you have to take the fact that there are other people into account. And it doesn't mean be who your parents think you should be either, even though that's another source of information that you might want to consider. It's a deeper question. It's like, what would actually motivate you? And you might think, well, I could never have that. It's like, that's not the question that's being addressed here. Although I would say, there's no sense floating off into some kind of impossible juvenile fantasy. We're making an assumption that you're taking the question seriously and that you're going to remain within the bounds of what you regard as sanely reasonable. So that's the first part. Second part was the opposite of that. It's like, okay, now you've specified a goal, where the goal is, in some sense, both your character and your life. And you've specified that rather vaguely. You only had 15 minutes to write about it. And that's a good thing, because now you have something to move toward. Now, I could tell you this technically. This is an interesting thing to know. People say they want to be happy. That's not true, by the way. If you investigate what people mean when they say they want to be happy, they say, I just want to be happy. It's a very funny phrase. It's, what do you mean, just? Like, there isn't anything harder than that. So you can't just say that's all you want. You just want to be happy all the time. That's all it would take. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to happen. So you can get rid of the just. And then, I want to be happy. Well, maybe. Actually, what people really mean when they say that is they don't want to suffer and be miserable. So really what they mean is they don't want to experience excess negative emotion. And you can find that out if you carefully question people and carefully analyze the answers. You find out they're actually more concerned about avoiding the catastrophic negative
than living in a world of hedonistic delight. Now, you also find that while avoiding the catastrophic tragedy, they wouldn't mind having a little bit of hedonistic delight. And so some happiness is interleaved in there. Then you might ask yourself, to the degree that people do want hedonistic delight when they're being happy, what does happy mean? And you might think, well, happy means getting what you want. Happy is how you feel after Christmas dinner. It's like, no, that's asleep, right? That's content and asleep. Now that's a form of contentment, but it isn't really what people mean when they say that they want to be happy. The happiness that people refer to when they talk about happiness has more to do with enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is an interesting word because it means, it's entheos. It means to be inspired. Inspired is in spirit. It means to be imbued with the Spirit. Well, enthusiastic is to be imbued with the Spirit of God, interestingly enough. And we'll return to that. When do you experience the positive emotion that's associated with happiness? The answer is, not when you've attained a goal, but when you're pursuing one. So you're set up, your positive emotion is associated with movement forward. You could say that your positive emotion is the psychological equivalent of forward movement, just as your negative emotion is the psychological equivalent of freezing or retreating. And so your emotions are very tightly tied to your action. Freeze, retreat, negative. Advance towards a goal, positive. No goal, no positive emotion. Now, if you don't remember anything else from tonight, that's a good thing to remember. No goal, no positive emotion. A corollary of that as well is no goal, confusion. So no goal not only means no positive emotion, it also means confusion, and confusion means anxiety and dread. And so a life without a goal is confusing and hopeless. And that begs a question, what should the goal be? And that's partly what we're trying to establish. You wrote for 15 minutes, you try to develop a vision for your life. Now you have something to move toward. That sets up the precondition for potential positive emotion and happiness. What else do you need to motivate you? Well, how about negative emotion? So what do you do with that? Well, negative emotion can stop you. You might think, well, I'd like to get a better job, but I'm afraid of putting myself out in the job market. I'm afraid of being evaluated. I'm afraid that if I tried something more difficult, I might fail. Then you have your negative emotion opposing you, right? It's anxiety is stopping you. And fair enough, because there are things to be anxious about. But what if you could get your negative emotion behind you, pushing you instead of stopping you? Sometimes in my clinical practice, I would have clients who hated their job. They're laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And maybe that was partly because they'd turned themselves into slaves, but it didn't matter. They were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. They needed to make a move, laterally or up. They needed to make a move. And they were often afraid to, and they had their reasons. They didn't want to contemplate their resumes. They didn't want to open up their CVs. They didn't want to face the inadequacies of their past. They were afraid of being evaluated. They were afraid of being rejected. They didn't know how to negotiate. They didn't know how to conduct themselves in an interview. They're afraid of losing the security they'd already built up. They had their fears, and they were real, and those fears stopped them. But they'd come to me and say, oh my God, you know, I'm so miserable. My life is so miserable. And we'd take that apart. And one of the reasons was because they were laboring under the thumb of a tyrant. And then we'd talk that through, and they'd say, well, I'm afraid to make a change. And I'd say, well, that's okay. That's understandable. How afraid are you of not making a change? Let's make a little vision of that. You're 35, you hate your job. What's the consequence? You're not motivated. You don't want to get out of bed in the morning. You're starting to get depressed. You're getting bitter. You're getting resentful. You're getting cynical. You're amotivated at work. You're not doing a very good job. And you're starting to shrink. Now play that out for 10 years. You don't change it, you don't fix it. And what happens? Well, it's not like it's going to get better of its own accord. What's going to happen to you? Well, for sure, at minimum, what's going to happen to you is you're going to be in the same situation, but 10 years older. And if you can't get out of that situation now, what the hell makes you think you're going to get out of it in 10 years? You're 10 years older, you're 10 years more bitter, you're 10 years more cynical. Maybe by that time your marriage has collapsed because who the hell wants to live with you? You're even more of a slave than you were because you've labored another 10 years under the thumb of the tyrant and stepped backwards every time you were asked to, so you got smaller and smaller as the tyrant got bigger and bigger. It's like, think about that, and that means imagine it. Imagine that, okay? Now that's the situation. You're stuck where you are, but it's 10 years from now. And when I say think of that, I mean imagine that. It's like really play it out. It's like, you know how miserable you are now? You're afraid of making the necessary changes, but you know how miserable you are now. Just imagine how miserable you could be in 10 years. And in all likelihood, what you'll find is that you're way more afraid of that than you are of whatever's stopping you in the present. It's really useful to know what your own particular brand of hell might be. And so one of the things we do in this writing exercise is have people do the reverse. It's like, okay, so imagine now, 5 years from now, you've let whatever temptations you're particularly susceptible to have the upper hand. And they've augured you into the ground. You know, one person's an alcoholic, another person's a criminal, another person's living on the street, someone else is like skirting the edges of prostitution, somebody else is narcissistic and bitter, somebody else is depressed and anxious. You know where you would fall off the edge of the earth if you fell off in whatever direction you're prone to fall off. Everyone knows that, but we avoid that. You know, that's rule 3. Do not hide things in the fog. Is that the rule? Do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Yeah, well, we often won't allow ourselves to imagine the catastrophe that we're pursuing, let's say through inaction. That's a good thing to fix. So now you say, well, you think for 15 minutes, that's not very long, about who you could be and what you could have if you could have what you wanted, if you were who you could be. And then you think about what sort of hell you could produce for yourself if you didn't do that. And that's not a bad polarity. It's like, I'm going to get away from that and I'm going to move towards that. And then you have your negative emotion working for you and your positive emotion working for you. And that's a good gradient, and that's a great gradient emotionally, because as I said, you don't experience positive emotion except in relationship to a goal. And if you got a nice gradient on your goal pursuit, then that's going to increase the degree to which you feel positive emotion. And positive emotion, by the way, isn't just about being happy. That's the most trivial part of it in some sense. Positive emotion allows you to focus. It's the soul of concentration. It's the essence of enthusiastic motivation. When you say, I really want to do that, that statement is predicated on the existence of positive emotion. It's the fact that the goal beckons to you that makes you say, I want to do that. And you know how much easier it is to do something you want to do than to do something you don't want to do. And that ease is actually a consequence of the activation of the system that governs positive emotion. And you might ask yourself, well, how powerful a system is that? And I would say, well, almost all of the drugs of abuse that people are most prone to abusing are abused because they activate the positive emotion system. So cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin is also a painkiller, but it has a psychomotor stimulant element. That's the technical term for the pharmacological effect of pharmacological agents on the positive emotion system. Psychomotor stimulation, psychomotor because it's associated with movement forward. And cocaine is such a powerful drug because it makes you feel like you're doing something worthwhile. That's the system it hyperactivates. And so it's a primary system of motivation. It's as old as forward movement itself. It's a cardinal source of meaning, and it only manifests itself in relationship to a goal. You're asked to outline the place you'd like to end up, which is your desired future, and also the place that you could end up if you let everything fall apart, is so that your anxiety chases you and your approach systems pull you forward. You're maximally motivated then. And it's important because otherwise you can be afraid of pursuing the things that you want to pursue, right? And that's very common. And so then the fear inhibits you as the promise pulls you forward, but it makes you weak because you're afraid. You want to get your fear behind you, pushing you. And so what you want to be is more afraid of not pursuing your goals than you are of pursuing them. Putting yourself in a challenging mind frame is much easier on you psychophysiologically, because you don't go into the generalized stress response to the same degree. And you're activating your exploratory and seeking systems, which are dopaminergically mediated and that involve positive emotion. So if you can face something voluntarily rather than having it chase you, it's way better for you psychophysiologically. So that's partly why, well, it's worthwhile to go find the dragon in its lair instead of waiting for it to come and eat you. So, and especially when you also add the idea that if you go find the dragon in its lair, you might find it when it's a baby instead of a full-fledged bloody monster that is definitely going to take you down. Don't avoid small problems that you know are there. Face them, because they'll grow into big problems all by themselves. And you can think about, imagine the tax department sends you a notification. You owe them like $300. Well, it's that's annoying. Maybe you don't even want to open the letter. Or maybe if you do, you just put it on the shelf. But that damn thing doesn't just sit there like a piece of paper on the shelf, right? You ignore that for 5 or 6 years, it's going to become attached to all sorts of horrible things. And if you ignore it long enough, you get the idea. It's going to turn into something that is completely unlike the little piece of paper that it's written on. And many, many problems in life are like that. You'll see that they pop their ugly little head up, and and you might want to turn away. You might not want to think about it, which is the easiest way of turning away, right? You just don't attend to it. You know, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, you know, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, you know, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then, so maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. Number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail, because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, you know, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do you do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. It's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, you know, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how will you say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Well, you might be wondering what a beam is, and a mote is a dust speck, and a beam is a very large piece of lumber. And so the issue is not so much the blindness of others, even though there's as much blindness among others as there is for you. But the issue here, the advice here, the description here is, you should be concerned about what's interfering with your own vision first. And you should leave other people the hell alone in relationship to that. And so if your mode of being in the world is, if you would just act better, things would improve for me, or if you identify the evil and the catastrophe as something that's outside, that someone else needs to fix, or that someone else is responsible for, then you're not going to fix that. And you're going to remain blind to the things that you're doing and not doing that make things not go well. And so it's just better to think, all right, I'm probably blind in many, many ways. And maybe there are some ways that I could rectify that, because it's highly probable that you're blind in all sorts of ways. I mean, in fact, it's virtually certain. And so it's just more useful to think, how is it that I'm wrong in this situation? I'll tell you something that I learned to do when I was arguing with my wife, which happened quite frequently, because when you actually communicate with people, you find out that there's many things that you don't agree on. And that's because you're actually different creatures. And so if you're actually going to have a truthful conversation, then you're going to find out that you don't see things the same way, and then you can either pretend that that's not the case and gloss over it and then end up in a 30-year silent war, or you can have the damn fight when you need to have it and see if you can straighten it out. So now and then we'd get in a situation where we were at loggerheads, we couldn't move. And, you know, it would spiral up into hate speech, let's say. Because, yeah, everyone laughs because they know they manifest plenty of hate speech towards those they love. So one of the things we learned to do was, when we hit an impasse, was to separate and to go our own ways, and to go sit and think, okay, look, we're at this unpleasant situation. We can't figure out how to move forward. I'd always think, of course it's her fault. Obviously it's her fault. At least 95%. But maybe there was something I did that contributed like 5% to it. And so I would sit and think and ask myself a question, which was, is there anything I did in the last 6 months that increased the probability that this impasse would manifest itself? And I'll tell you, you have no idea how fast your mind will generate an answer to a question like that. Because there's undoubtedly some idiotic thing that you did, that you know, that you remember, that increased the probability that you're going to have your hands around the throat of the person that you love. And then you can go tell them that. And then you can have a conversation, especially if they do the same thing. Say, look, you know, here's how I'm an idiot in this situation. And the other person says, well, yeah, here's how I'm an idiot. And then you're two idiots, and then maybe you can have a conversation. So, thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam of out of thine own eye, and then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote of thy brother's eye. That's, hey, hard to argue with that. Ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. That sounded pretty optimistic again. But again, I think it's a description of the structure of existential reality, and by which I mean, when I'm in my clinical practice and I observe, and this is also the case with my students, is let's say, people's lives aren't what they would like them to be. And so then you ask, why? Well, forget about tragedy and catastrophe, because that's self-evident, and we're not going to discuss that. Although the degree to which you bring about your own tragedy is always indeterminate. But I would never say that every terrible thing that is visited on a person is something they deserved. I think that that's a very dangerous presupposition, especially because everyone gets sick and everyone dies. But one of the main reasons that people don't get what they want is because they don't actually figure out what it is. And the probability that you're going to get what would be good for you, let's say, which would even be better than what you want, right? Because, you know, you might be wrong about what you want easily. But maybe you could get what would really be good for you. Well, why don't you? Well, because you don't try. You don't think, okay, here's what I would like if I could have it. And I don't mean in a way that you manipulate the world to force it to deliver you goods for status or something like that. That isn't what I mean. I mean something like, imagine that you were taking care of yourself like you were someone you actually cared for. And then you thought, okay, I'm caring for this person. I would like things to go as well for them as possible. What would their life have to be like in order for that to be the case? Well, people don't do that. They don't sit down and think, all right, you know, let's figure it out. You've got a life. It's hard, obviously. It's like 3 years from now, you can have what you need. You've got to be careful about it. You can't have everything. You can have what would be good for you, but you have to figure out what it is, and then you have to aim at it. Well, my experience with people has been is, if they figure out what it is that would be good for them, and then they aim at it, then they get it. And it's strange because they don't it's a strange thing. It's not quite that simple because, you know, you may formulate an idea about what would be good for you, and then you take 10 steps towards that, and you find out that your formulation was a bit off, and so you have to reformulate your goal. You know, so you're kind of going like this as you move towards the goal. But a huge part of the reason that people fail is because they don't ever set up the criteria for success. And so, since success is a very narrow line and very unlikely, the probability that you're going to stumble on it randomly is 0. And so there's a proposition here, and the proposition is, if you actually want something, you can have it. Now the question then would be, well, what do you mean by actually want? And the answer is that you reorient your life in every possible way to make the probability that that will occur as certain as possible. And that's a sacrificial idea, right? It's like, you don't get everything. Obviously. But maybe you can have what you need. And maybe all you have to do to get it is ask. But asking isn't a whim or today's wish. It's like, you have to be deadly serious about it. You have to think, okay, like, I'm taking stock of myself. And if I was going to live properly in the world, and I was going to set myself up such that being would justify itself in my estimation, and I don't mean as a harsh judge, exactly what is it that I would aim at? Well, one of the things I've found is that in test of this theory, let's say, you could try this. This is a form of prayer, knocking. Sit on your bed one day and ask yourself, what remarkably stupid things am I doing on a regular basis to absolutely screw up my life? And if you actually ask that question, but you have to want to know the answer, right? Because that's actually what asking the question means. It doesn't mean just mouthing the words. It means you have to decide that you want to know. You'll figure that's out so fast it'll make your hair curl. It's as if Jung thought about this. He thought that people had two poles of consciousness, and one was the individual consciousness that we each identify with, and the other was something he called the self, and the self is you might think about it as the divine within. That's close enough approximation. It's the universal part of your consciousness. It's your conscience. That's another way of thinking about it, whatever your conscience is. But it's something that you can consult. It's like the Socratic daemon. Socrates said that the thing that made him different than everyone else in Greece was that he consulted his daemon, his genius. He asked himself how it was that he should conduct himself in the world, and then he did that, whatever it was. He didn't try to force a solution, he didn't try to force a solution selfishly. He asked, I'm going to manifest myself in the best possible manner in the world. I would like to do that. What would that be? Well, you're perfectly capable of thinking. God only knows how. You're perfectly capable of immense feats of imagination and dream and fantasies. God only knows how you do all of that. What would happen if you consulted yourself about the best possible outcome for you? You might get an answer. Well, that's what this proposition is. If you're hungry, it's not a deterministic drive. It's a subpersonality that has a goal, and then it has a bunch of action patterns that are going to work in reference to that goal. It has a bunch of perceptions that suit that goal, and it organizes your emotional responses around that goal. And so to think about it as a personality is it's a much more intelligent way to look at it. One of the things about Skinner's rats, Skinner could get rats to do almost everything, and he would reward them with food. And so he had a simple rat model, but his rats were starved down to 75% of their normal body weight. So not only were they not social, gregarious rats like rats are, because they were isolated, they were genetically altered from wild rats, but they also weren't as complex as a real rat because they were starving. And so, but a starving rat is a pretty good model of a rat, and a rat is a pretty good model of a person. But a lot of our models of simple behavioral learning were based on starving, isolated rats. So, anyways, how to think about motivation? We'll think about it from the hypothalamic perspective. So we could say one thing that motivation does is set goals. And we could say that emotions track progress towards goals. And I'm going to use that schema even though it's not exactly right. So you say, well, motivation determines where you're going to aim. So if you're hungry, you're going to aim at something to eat. And then that will organize your perceptions so that you zero out everything that isn't relevant to that task, which is almost everything. You concentrate on those few things that are going to facilitate your movement forward. When you encounter those things, that produces positive emotion as you move through the world towards your goal, and you see that things are laying themselves out that facilitate your movement forward. Those things cause positive emotion. And if you encounter anything that gets in the way, then that produces negative emotion, and it can be like threat, because you're not supposed to encounter something that gets in the way. It can be anger, so that you move it away. It can be frustration, disappointment, grief. Those would, if you had a response that serious to an obstacle, it would probably punish the little motivated frame right out of existence. So you walk downstairs and, I don't know, the contracting company has set a wrecking ball through your kitchen. It's like, that's going to be disappointing. You're not going to keep eating the peanut butter sandwich in the rubble. That little frame is going to get punished out of existence, and some new goal is going to pop up in its stead. And one of the things we're going to try to sort out is how do you decide when you've encountered an obstacle that's so big that you should just quit and go do something else? Because that's not obvious. And you can get into counterproductive persistence pretty easily. So we don't know how people solve that problem. It's a really complicated one. So anyways, we're going to work on that scenario. Your hypothalamus pops up micro goals that are directly relevant to biological survival. That produces a frame of reference. So it's not a goal, it's not a drive, and it's not a collection of behaviors. It's a little personality. And the personality has a viewpoint, it has thoughts that go along with it, it has perceptions, it has action tendencies, all of that. You can see this in addiction, most particularly. So one of the things that you find often with people who are alcoholic is they lie all the time. And that's because when they've built a little alcohol-dependent personality inside of themselves, or a big one, maybe it's 90% of their personality, and one of the things that consists of is all the rationalizations that they've used over the years to justify their addiction to themselves and to other people. And so the addiction has a personality, you know, and so when the person is off, or maybe they're addicted to meth or something like that, where, you know, the addiction is more, it's more short-term powerful, than I would say, than an alcohol addiction. They'll say anything, and the words are just tools used to get towards the goal. And if they happen to be deceptive, whatever, it doesn't matter. They're just practical tools to get towards the goal. And then when you get towards the goal and you take a nice shot of meth or something like that, you reinforce all those rationales that you use to get the drug, and then the next time you're even a better deceiver and liar. So, okay, so we're going to say motivations, one way of thinking about it is they set goals, but it's not the right way of thinking about it. They produce a whole framework of interpretation. And so we're going to think about that framework of interpretation. And then emotions emerge inside of that. So that's it. So the world is framed, motivation set goals. You could say the world has to be framed. So motivation sets that frame. Goals, emotions, perceptions, and actions. And then actions track progress. So positive emotion says you're moving forward properly towards your goal. And if you encounter something you don't expect, you stop. That's anxiety. It's like, oh, we're not where we thought we were. And so we don't know what to do, so we should stop, because we don't know where we are or what we're doing. Stop, frozen. And then the more powerful negative emotions like pain, they might make you get out of there. So emotions, forward, stop, reverse. That's your emotions within that motivated frame. So, and that's another example of how your mind is embedded in your body. Your emotions are like they're offshoots of action tendencies. That's the right way to think about it, because action is everything fundamentally. So what are some basic motivations? Most of these are regulated by the hypothalamus, by the way, and that tells you just how important a control system it is. The other thing that's useful to know about the hypothalamus is that it has projections going up from it that are like tree trunks, and inhibitory projections coming down that are like grapevines. So you can kind of control your hypothalamus as long as it's not on too much, but if it's on in any serious way, it's like it wins. So partly what you do to stop yourself from falling under the dominion of your hypothalamus is to never ever be anywhere where its action is necessary, right? You don't want to go into a biker bar, because you might find yourself in a situation where panicked defensive aggression is immediately necessary. You probably don't want that. You don't want the panic, you don't want the terror, you don't want the frenzied fight, you don't want any of that. You don't want to have to run away in absolute panic. So you just don't go there. And a huge part of how we regulate our emotions is just by never going anywhere where we have to experience them. And so that has very little to do with internal inhibitory control and everything to do with staying where you belong. So, okay, so basic motivations: hunger, thirst, pain. Pain is not regulated by the hypothalamus. That's a different circuit. Anger / aggression, thermoregulation, panic and escape, affiliation and care, sexual desire, exploration, play. And you can kind of break those in, you can kind of break those into the classic Darwinian categories too, and say, well, there's a set of motivations that go along with self-maintenance. That'd be your survival. Ingestive and defensive. See, I've sort of coded them there. So the self-maintenance, there's an ingestive set of basic motivations that go with self-maintenance. You say that's hunger, thirst. There's a set of defensive motivations: pain, anger, thermoregulation, panic and escape. And then there's motivations that are associated with reproduction: affiliation, care, and sexual desire. And then I put exploration and play sort of outside of that. I would say because those two things serve both of these approximately equally. Another way of thinking about this too, you know, in the Abrahamic stories, God calls to Abraham to get him to leave his father's tent. He's there like till he's 80, you know, lagging around, lolling around, being useless, and the call to adventure arises, and it's attributed to the voice of God, and Abraham goes out in the world, and he has a hell of a terrible time of it. He encounters famine and tyranny and conspiracy to steal his wife, and like it's really quite dreadful, to the point where you might think that Abraham was a lot better off just being in his tent. But the story insists that Abraham's adventure is not only necessary, but a precondition for, well, for the entirety of Western civilization that follows in his stead, essentially. And so it's difficult, but necessary. And I think there's an analogy between the voice that calls Abraham as an individual away from his father's tent, you know, the safe confines of his father's tent, and the political voice that calls Moses to pull his entire people out of the tyranny in Egypt. I don't think that's an unreasonable parallelism. And so God in that situation is the voice of adventure and the voice of freedom. Okay, now, Moses heeds this call and convinces the Pharaoh, eventually, to let the Israelites go. And so they leave tyranny. And the story is very interesting to me because it's so sophisticated in structure, because you might think once you get out of the tyranny, problem solved, right? And you could even think about this in terms of the tyranny of your own preconceptions. You drop the constraints you've laid upon yourself, the arbitrary constraints you've laid upon yourself, or you stop imposing your will on other people, or you escape from political or social tyranny, and everything's immediately better. And that's not what happens in the story at all. What happens is that the Israelites go from the tyranny into the desert. And it's not obvious at all that the desert is an improvement over the tyranny. And it's also a very strange story, because if you think about the story geographically, the desert that the Israelites were hypothetically wandering through isn't that big. And they're there for like 45 years, and you think, well, that's kind of a failure of leadership. It'd take like 2 weeks to walk across the desert, yet they're out there for 45 years or 40 years. What can that possibly mean? And what it means, I think, it means a variety of things, but apart from the fact that it's out of the tyranny into the desert, which is really something to think about. Like, why won't you drop your stubborn preconceptions if they're just constraining you, you know? Or why would people subject themselves to totalitarian oppression if they could just let it go and then everything would be all right? And the answer is, everything wouldn't be all right. It might get worse initially. And that's sort of what seems to happen in the Exodus story. It's like in the desert. And how long? 40 years, 3 generations. So you might think, well, we're better off in the bloody tyranny. And lots of times, we've seen this in the modern world, there were no shortage of people in the Soviet Union once the Soviet Union collapsed, even after the terrible 1990s, who were, what would you call it, reminisced fondly about the good old Stalinist days. And you can kind of understand that, because maybe knowing exactly what you should be doing all the time is preferable to not knowing what the hell's going on ever. And maybe that's the distinction between the tyranny and the desert. You know, you drop the tyranny, but then what? Well, what happens in the desert? The Israelites are wandering around there for like decades, and they fight amongst themselves. And Moses has to act as a judge. I won't get into that too much, but he judges them for a very long period of time, for many, many hours every day, trying to help them regulate their behavior now that they don't have a central authority. They also become faithless. That the story insists upon this, that they lose their faith in the God that called them out of Egypt. And so you could say they lose faith. This is one way of thinking about it. They lose faith in the principle of freedom. And it's not that surprising, because now they're free, they're in the desert, and so that's kind of rough. And so why wouldn't they continue with their faith in the God that called them to freedom? It says, well, look where you brought us. This isn't so good. And then they start to worship false idols. And that's relevant to tonight's topic of discussion, because we're talking about ideology, right? I said abandon ideology. It's the same idea, false idols. What makes an idol false? The Israelites are thinking, well, God and his desire for freedom brought us to this desert. How about a new God? You know, one that's not so annoying, let's say. And so that's all well and good, and they start worshiping all sorts of different idols, golden calf, for example, and they're having a fine old time of it, fractionating into their multiple groups of belief, worshiping false idols. I should make just a side note about what worship means, because it's a weird word. And I would say, you know, if you hero worship someone, then you want to be like them. And so worship has that fundamental element of mimicry. And so that's tied nicely to this notion that what you believe is what you act out, not what you say is true. And so to worship something is to be compelled by the desire to imitate it. You know, you might say, well, if you're a big fan of a star, someone make a joke near you and say, well, you worship that person. It's like, well, it's not exactly a joke. The grip of that admiration is part of the impetus to imitate. And so then I would say, well, just as what you value most highly is that which you act out, what you worship is that which compels you to imitate. That's what the act of worship means. To imitate and to celebrate. To celebrate is to put at the highest place. To say this is the highest of values. And so now the Israelites are out in the desert and they're worshiping false idols, which means they're putting the wrong thing in the highest place. And then we have the same objection. How do you know that it's the wrong thing? Which is the same question. How do you know when a belief is an ideological belief and when it's valid? Or can you even say such a thing? And how do you know when you're saying it that you're not just falling into the same trap? I'm trying to puzzle that out piece by piece. I want to tell you a side story here, then we'll go back to the narrative. A couple of side stories. On the back of your dollar bill, there's a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid, there's a cap, and the cap is separated from the pyramid, and there's an eye in the cap. Okay. And then in the Washington Monument, at the top of the Washington Monument, there's a pyramid, and at the top of the pyramid, there's a cap, and it's made out of aluminum. In ancient Egypt, that cap was made out of gold. And the reason it's made out of aluminum in Washington is because aluminum was more expensive than gold when the Washington Monument was made, and they wanted to make the cap of the pyramid, which is the thing at the very top of the pyramid, they wanted to make it out of the most valuable material. Now, why would you want to make what's at the top of the pyramid out of what's most valuable? And the answer to that is something like, the thing that's at the top of the pyramid, since it's at the top, should be the thing that's most valuable. And what's most valuable? Well, gold's valuable. Why? Well, it's like the sun. It's incorruptible. It's a noble metal. It gleams like the sun. It's a symbol of value. And so the notion there is that the thing that's at the very pinnacle of the pyramid should be the thing that's most valuable. And then we're back to the question. How do you know that something is valuable compared to something else? Okay, so put that aside, back to the Exodus story. So the Israelites are worshiping all these false idols, and God's getting upset about this. And he sends a bunch of poisonous snakes in amongst the Israelites to bite them. And which seems kind of heavy-handed, you might say, because the poor Israelites, they're thinking, tyranny, desert, snakes, you know, enough. And fair enough, you know, I have all sorts of sympathy for their position, because out of the tyranny into the desert, that's no joke. And then to add snakes to that seems like too much. But doesn't matter, because you'll find yourself in your life at times when you've gone out of the tyranny into the desert and you're suffering plenty, and then the snakes come and you're suffering even more. And well, the Israelites get together and they go to Moses. They get together and they think, okay, enough snakes. We'll repent. They go to Moses and they say, look, we get it. Can you have a chat with God? Get him to call off the snakes. And so Moses says, I'll see what I can do. And he goes and has a chat with God. And he says, you know, you're stiff-necked people. It's a reference to the Pharaoh. Repent. Do you think you could do something about the snakes? And God has a perfect opportunity there to just get rid of the snakes since he brought them. But that isn't what happens. And that's extremely It's extremely strange, at least. Now, I'm not going to claim that what I am going to tell you that I think it means is what it means, because who knows these things. But I think we could all agree that at the very least, that's very strange. The whole story is strange, but that's strange. Moses goes to God. He says you could call off the snakes, and God doesn't. He says something almost incomprehensible. Instead, he says, you should take Moses already has a staff. It's the staff of Moses, and he's done all sorts of magic tricks with it before, like turning it into a snake and having it turn back into a staff. And I won't get into that. That's a very interesting idea in and of itself. But God tells Moses' staff is also the staff of God. It's the thing that Moses relies on. It's, in some sense, it's the thing he can lean on. And so the staff is something you can lean on. And when you're walking, of course, the staff helps you stand and walk. And so it's a support. It's something reliable. Anyways, God tells Moses, take the staff and cast it in bronze, and then cast a snake in bronze, so make a sculpture, and stick the snake on the staff and put the staff in the ground, and then have the Israelites go look at the snake. And if they do that, then they won't be poisoned when they get bitten. And you think, what the hell is going on with that story? It's like, it's so peculiar. You know, this is one of those situations with the story you think there's either something deep going on here, or it's completely, I don't know what your conclusion can be. It's incomprehensibly strange, but that's the story. And so anyways, the Israelites go and they look at the snake, and then they're not poisoned anymore. And then here's even a weirder twist on that story. So many thousands of years later, Christ says, according to the Gospels, that he has to be lifted up like the snake Moses hung on the staff in the desert, which takes a story that's already unbelievably peculiar and makes it way more peculiar. Because you think, well, why in the world would someone who is reputed to be the savior of humanity, regardless of whether or not you believe that, why would he associate himself with a snake? And then, especially given, the reputation of the snake, and more particularly, why associate himself with the particular snake that Moses used because God told him to in the desert? It's another one of those situations where there's either something going on here that's extremely mysterious, or what is it? What is it? Is it a kind of insanity? It's not obvious at all what to do with that story. But here's what you do with it if you're a clinical psychologist, or if you're me and you're a clinical psychologist. One of the things we have learned is that we've learned a couple of things as clinicians, let's say. Here's one: honest speech cures people. Right? So Freud, in some sense, was the first person to really formulate that clinically. He said, come to my practice, and you can lay on this couch, and you just say whatever comes into your mind with zero censorship. And the consequence of that will be your thoughts will weave a pathway to your problems, which will then reveal themselves in a manner that, in principle, allows you to, for Freud, express the emotion associated with the problem and be cured as a consequence. Now, I don't think Freud had that right, because it's not the expression of the emotion that's curative, but it is the case that clinicians have agreed that untrammeled speech, so that would be free speech, except in the clinical setting, is in fact curative. And you kind of know that, right? Because you have people around you, perhaps, that you can tell the truth to, and vice versa. And there are times when, well, all the time, that might be painful because they tell the truth, and so do you, but it's really helpful, and sometimes it's absolutely bloody necessary, right? Especially if you're in trouble, because you want someone that you can tell the truth to who will return the favor. And because thought is associated with adaptation, then true thought is going to be associated with redemption. So the truth sets you free in that regard. And so that's one thing that clinicians have all converged on, regardless of their school of clinical endeavor. And here's another. If you voluntarily confront what you're afraid of, you get braver. And so the behavior therapists, the Freudians figured this out a bit, because they would have you revisit trauma that occurred earlier in your life. And that's a pretty common therapeutic technique. We should talk about those things that still plague you emotionally. I don't think we should talk about them so that you get to express the associated emotion. I think we should talk about them so you figure out how it was that you were vulnerable enough so that you got hurt, and then figure out how to not have that happen anymore. I think that's really the conclusion of a century's worth of clinical practice. But the other conclusion is, you face what you're afraid of voluntarily, you get better. So if people have a phobia of elevators, they're agoraphobic, you can teach them slowly to approach an elevator and to open it and to go inside it, and their fear of the elevator will radically decrease. And their fear of many other things will decrease simultaneously, because it turns out that when you face the things you're afraid of voluntarily, you don't get less afraid. You get braver. And that's better than less afraid, because imagine if it's just less afraid, you'd have to expose yourself to every single thing you were ever afraid of, in order to become less afraid. But if you got braver, you just expose yourself to some of the things that, that intimidate you, and there'd be a growth of personality as a consequence of that, and then you'd be better off in facing all of the things you're afraid of. Well, that's what happens in the desert. So there's this weird idea, and I don't know what to make of it exactly, but you can see what you can make of it. God could have just called off the snakes, but he seems to have made a decision that no, the snakes are there and there's nothing that can be done about them, but you can make people a hell of a lot better than they are. And one of the ways you do that is by encouraging them to voluntarily confront the things they're afraid of.
We've met some of your fans, and we got the impression they were all male fans, the ones that we talked to, and that they were struggling with their manhood, and that you give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally. And the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. If we had any sense, we'd understand that, instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power, of all the insane propositions.
My audiences are often composed mostly of men between, say, 20 and 35. Not exactly young, but young enough. And they're desperate for a discussion about responsibility and fair play and noble being and working properly in the world, and the idea, and to hear the idea that their lives actually matter, that if they straighten themselves up and fly right, that they'll have a beneficial effect on themselves and their family and the community, and that the world is starving for that. And for them as individuals, not for them as a group, but for each of them as individuals. So, yeah, it breaks me up. Every time the topic comes up, it breaks me up because it's so damn sad. And we're so stupid. We're alienating young men. We're telling them that they're patriarchal oppressors and denizens of rape culture and you know, tyrants in waiting, and we fail to discriminate between their competence and their tyranny. And it's awful. It's so destructive. It's so unnecessary, and it's so sad. And so whenever I think about it, especially because of all that I've seen of it, it makes me sad, like deeply. It's so sad. I got together with the woman who was going to become my wife, Tammy. I mean, I've known her since we were 8, and she was a friend of mine when I was a kid. And so we've known each other forever, but we got together seriously when we were in our late 20s, and she was really ready to have a family, like now. And I didn't have a permanent job at that point, although my prospects were good, which was part of the reason she married me. But she wanted to start, and I thought, okay, so I didn't really want to do that. And I thought, okay, what's your problem, Jordan? What is it that you're worried about? And I thought, well, there's an economic issue. That's not really serious. I'll get a job, and she'll come along wherever I go if I have that job. So that's not an issue. It's like, so what then? Well, babies. What the hell do I know about babies? Nothing. I can't take care of a baby. I don't know how to do that. So I said to her, well, the reason I seem to be objecting is because I'm kind of doubtful about the infant stage. Like toddlers, I know what to do with them. I can play with kids. But when they're under a year, they're like a foreign object to me in many ways. I don't know what to do, and so that worries me. And so I'll tell you what, if you'll take primary care for the infant, I'll take care of you and the infant. And how would that be? And I think that's the right role. I really do believe that. And you might think, well, that's sexist. It's like, well, no, not necessarily. How are you so sure that that first year as a mother isn't one of the great parts of the fundamental adventure of being female? Like, so don't give me any crap about that being sexist. That's just, I don't think so. You know, and so what I would do is watch my wife, and if she got tired, spell her off. And I did what I could to take care of the infant, but I knew that, you know, she would take care of that while I stumbled around trying to learn how. And she did that. And that worked fine. And then, you know, as the kids got older, I took more and more responsibility for them. And when my daughter was about 2.5, I think that's right, 1.5, we had our second child. And then I took care of Michaela, the older child, quite a lot after that, because Tammy, of course, was busy, especially that first year with the infant, with Julian. But that worked well. That was a good division of labor as far as I was concerned. And also my wife was very happy about that, because she loved to take care of infants. And that's characteristic of a lot of women, you know, and even those that don't admit it. And it's too bad they don't admit it, because what, there's something wrong with that? Is there some? I saw this tweet the other day about this grandmother, mother of a mature daughter, and the daughter had announced that she was never going to have kids, and her mother said, "Oh, I think that's just great. You know, you're gonna just live for you, and that's just wonderful, and I'm glad you can be so independent." And I thought, how could you possibly say something that stupid to your daughter? It's like, you don't want grandchildren? And you're so sure that she's just not ideologically addled about the fundamental realities and beauties and depth of life? It's like, how many things do? We have a career if we're lucky, or a job if we don't. If we're not, we have an intimate relationship, we have a family. That's life, man. You miss one of those, well, you can do it, but it's a big deal not to do that. This instinct we have to find someone to admire, that's the deepest of religious instincts, and it's unbelievably deep in human beings. You know, you notice you admire someone, that is the instinct to mimic. Because to admire is then to want to be that. And that's the action of the moral instinct. It finds a target in the world and it says, well, I could be like that. But at first it says, this person is attractive or this person is compelling. It grabs you. It grabs you. And that's the instinct for further development. It's a very positive thing. It can be a very positive thing. The hallmark of true sovereignty is the willingness of the elite, let's say the talented, the productive, the blessed, the gifted, to justify the unequal division of talent by serving to ameliorate the catastrophic suffering of the dispossessed. Now, Nietzsche warned about that, right? He thought that Christianity would devolve in some sense into the woke nightmare that it has devolved into. But I think he failed to give the devil his entire due. And the notion that the highest is the highest because it voluntarily serves the lowest, that's a deadly idea. And I don't think it's an ideological idea at all. I think it's an idea that removes the paradox of human existence. And so there's that, but then there's another insistence in both Judaism and Christianity, and I'm not saying it's limited to those doctrines, by the way, that the way to deal with suffering is not to avoid it or to circumvent it with a shallow hedonism, but to face it intensely, head on, and voluntarily in its full manifestation. And so one of the things I've realized about the Passion story, which Jung regarded as an archetypal tragedy and in some sense a limit case, right? A story so tragic that you cannot write a more tragic story.
Right.
Is that it drags the observer, and so that's all of us in Christendom, through the entire catastrophe of human existence, right? So it confronts you with the mob that's after you, that you are also part of. It confronts you with moral relativism in the shape of Pontius Pilate. It confronts you with the oppression of the totalitarian state of foreigners, let's say, in the guise of Rome. It confronts you with the betrayal of your best friend. It confronts you with the willingness of the crowd to punish the virtuous and free the criminal. And that's the story of Barabbas and Christ. And Pajot told me the other day, Jonathan Pajot, that an alternative name for Barabbas was Jesus. And that what the crowd did was pick the political revolutionary over the spiritual leader. And that's perfect. And then it confronts you with the reality that we all face our own mortality, and too early. And the fact that sometimes the innocent and virtuous are punished. And so and then of course there's the horrible, tragic, torturous death, all of that. And that's all signified by the image of the crucifix and what we're doing to ourselves, even though we don't know it. I'm speaking mostly psychologically, although somewhat theologically, is that we're exposing ourselves to the ultimate catastrophe of human existence, while simultaneously manifesting the faith that if we face that unflinchingly, that will resurrect us instead of killing us.
That's quite powerful.
It's something, man. It's something. It's something I've been puzzling out for, well, a long time, but particularly for the last 6 months. I'm going to write about that in my new book. And when I talk to my audiences about that, and I would especially say this has an impact, again, on demoralized young men, and say, look, we don't know the limits to the expansion of your personality if you're willing to face things without deception. And that's a variant of that radical honesty we were already talking about. Don't live by lies. Well, life is rife with injustice, atrocity, and suffering. And so what do you do with that? Do you avoid it? There's good physiological evidence, by the way, that if you take two groups of people and you subject one group to a stressor involuntarily, and you get the other group to take on the stressor voluntarily, that the pattern of psychophysiological response is entirely different. It's entirely different emotionally, motivationally, and in terms of the damage it does. And so the involuntary imposition of a threat is stressful and damaging, but the voluntary acceptance of a threat is invigorating and revivifying. Now, it would be nice if we could be optimistic. And I think, again, the problem with being optimistic is that it's naive. So then the question is there an optimism that's not naive? And I think there is. And the optimism that's not naive is in just a a visualization of how strong people can be. So one of the things that I tell people, I've told my students in my class in Maps of Meaning, here's a goal. You want to be the person at the funeral of your father that everyone can rely on. How would that be? You want to be the person who's broken and useless and adding to the misery in the corner. And look, I'm not making light of people's grief. You know, I understand grief. But who do you want to be when there's a crisis? Right? Do you want to be the person that everyone can turn to for strength? It's like, why the hell not? Why not that as a goal? That'd be a good goal, because then if there's a crisis, and there will be, it won't be such a bloody crisis, because there'll be someone there that can deal with it. You know, so when I went and talked to these people at the funeral home, I envisioned that. I thought, okay, well, this is something you have to contend with if you're going to be alive and adult. You have to contend with death and suffering, and you have to be ready for it. And you have to be there for the person, because that's all they're going to have. And so there's a goal, man. And in this time of nihilism, you know, it's what's the point of life? People ask, and they're taught that at universities. What's the point of life? Everything's interpretation. Humanity's a cancer on the planet. You know? Well, how about no? How about not that? How about that there's something to us? It's known from multiple dimensions simultaneously that the system that produces happiness, let's say in the founder's sense, produces that emotion in relationship to the observation of movement towards a valued goal. And so you can derive some conclusions from that. The first is that without a goal, there's no happiness, by definition, because happiness marks movement towards a valued goal. The next is, well, the higher the goal, the more value there is in the observation of movement towards it. And so out of that, you might ask, well, then what's the highest goal? Because why don't we go for that? Well, then you could say, well, you should do your best for the best. You might say, well, that's just to make me hedonically happy. It's like, well, wait a second, you know, cocaine will work for that, because it actually even activates this system. But what about tomorrow and next week and next month? And so the problem with hedonism as a goal is, first of all, it vanishes when you're suffering. But even failing that, if you're serving yourself hedonically in the narrow sense, it's just about me and my pleasure. It's like, okay, which you? Today's you, tomorrow's you, next week's you, next month's you. What about next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? You're going to lead a hedonic and dissolute life, and what are you going to be, a burnt-out shell and a wreck, a dismal wreck in 10 years? Because that's what will happen. And so if you don't construe yourself as a community stretched out across time, then you're not even serving yourself. And if you do construe yourself as a community stretched across time, then serving other people and serving yourself turn out to be exactly the same thing. I just did a course on the Sermon on the Mount, and Christ, in one of the sections of that sermon, he says to people that you shouldn't lose your saltiness, you shouldn't lose your savor, and you're the salt of the earth, and without that salt, everything loses its flavor. And salt is a preservative, and it's a spice, and that's often conceptualized, that phrase, as referring to the salt of the earth, you know, the solid, reliable types who bear all burdens. But that is not what it means. I looked at a lot of different translations. I talked to a lot of people about that verse, and really what it means is, well, there should be some spiciness and unpredictability and humor about you. And there should be some play in the system, right? Because that's what stops you from just being the narrow, dead, past letter of the law with no spirit. There should be some snake inside the tree, right? There should be some fire inside the bush. Those are all ways of construing that are symbolically equivalent. There should be some dynamism in you, and a fair bit of that's associated with, well, enthusiasm. That's fun, but enthusiasm means to be imbued with the Spirit of God. That's why people like comedians so much too, because that's what they do. And so you have to leaven the duty with humor, and your book does a lovely job of that too, because your book, which is a very conservative book in the best possible way, and is a call to duty and responsibility,
But you constantly return to themes of both stoicism and humor, which are tied together in some sense, you know. I was just in Newfoundland for the last week doing a documentary there. Newfoundland's a rough rock, and it's beautiful and harsh. And the people there are tough and resilient, man, because they had to be. And Newfies have a great sense of humor, and they're always making fun. And that's a necessary leaven, right? That ability to deal with serious matters in a light touch, with a light touch. And it's something I'm trying to learn to do more and more, even in the most serious of conversations, you know, because if you're a master, you've got both. You've got that light touch and that sense of humor. You really see that in military people who've been through rough situations. When you see someone in the depths of genuine suffering, hopefully what you're trying to do is to throw a lifeline. And one possible lifeline is compassion. And that's probably the right lifeline to throw an infant, you know, who's suffering. That sort of overwhelming compassion. But for someone who is an adult or making progress towards being an adult, the lifeline that might be thrown is there's something within you that would let you be more than you are, and much more, and maybe enough more so that you could actually deal with this suffering so it didn't turn into hell and take everything along with it. And there isn't anything more optimistic than that. You say something here, which I think is extremely, I'm going to read something from your book here. It is true that character is to some extent innate. I would say what that does is that it provides each of us with a range of talents and a range of temptations. And so it's something like that. So it's the hand we're dealt, and there's certainly a genetic element to that. Our genetic makeup imbues in us certain proclivities. But it is as true that character is mostly a consequence of choices. Strangely enough, we all make them, and we should make them deliberately with the knowledge that these choices are part of our responsibility toward a purpose other than our own selfish aims. That responsibility is to your family, friends, community, and country. That's something that conservatives put forward as a pathway to virtue, you know. And what's so interesting about that, as far as I'm concerned, as an antidote to atomistic liberalism, let's say, that hyper-privileges the individual, is that it's definitely been my observation as a clinical psychologist that in the depths of misery, the capability that you have to be of service to other people, your family, your friends, your community, your country, that's actually a saving grace under such circumstances. You know, and that people really find a deep and abiding meaning in that service. So it's not just finger wagging and the pointing towards duty. It's like, no, you don't understand that if you're in desperate straits, if your life is falling apart, if you're nihilistic and miserable, and maybe you have your bloody reasons, because maybe you do, that's still the case that if you step outside yourself and you try to make the lives of other people better, that's the best possible thing that you can do for yourself. What we mean by soul is something like animating spirit. And you might say, well, what's a spirit? And well, that's actually rather easy to answer. So when a child of 4 is playing house, let's say when a child of 4 is playing house, she acts out the role of the mother. But acting out, that's a strange thing, right? Because she doesn't literally duplicate in her actions or her perceptions in the game what she observed her mother literally doing. So, for example, she didn't go into her mother's bedroom when her mother awoke and watched her turn her head in a particular way to awaken and count the number of blinks so that she could mimic that in her play. And, you know, you think that's absurd, but it's not absurd if it's just mimicry. It's not. It's unbelievably sophisticated. So what the girl does is she watches her mother manifest maternal behavior across a vast array of instances, and she integrates that with the image of the mother she's received from all the books she's been read and all the little movies she's watched, the Disney movies and so forth, and she abstracts out the animating principle of the maternal, and then she embodies that in play, and usually with a little boy, and that's practice for what's going to come later. It's unbelievably sophisticated, and she's embodying a spirit, and the spirit there is the abstraction of the central animating principle from multiple embodiments of its manifestation. And if you think children can't do that, well, then you don't know anything about children, because they do that all the time in their pretend play, which is a necessary precursor to healthy psychological development. And so part of what we refer to as the soul is the presence of that spirit, or maybe even the capacity of embodying such spirits. And it's very difficult to know how deep that goes. You know, I had a vision at one point of all the men in my life who've been particularly influential in a benevolent way. You know, and you think, well, just a mere notion of the idea that there could be a benevolent way that would unite the acts of benevolence across a series of men, that's all comprehensible to you. You take that as a matter of course when you say that there are such things as good men, and you can identify them, right? Something stable about whatever is good across multiple manifestations of incarnation, let's say. And I saw that transform into the Father person of the Trinity as the embodiment of that benevolent spirit. Now, I don't have any idea what that means metaphysically, because who does? But that spirit manifesting itself within is certainly part of what we refer to when we talk about the soul. And you can see that shine through people. I mean, it's part of what gives someone charisma. It's part of what elicits the instinct to imitate in you. You know, and you see that even in simple things. When you see a remarkable athlete do something incredibly athletic to put the soccer ball, the football ball through the net, to score the goal, and everybody leaps to their feet in celebration of that, well, that's a celebration of the divine capacity to hit the target dead on. And it grips you at such a low level, way down inside your soul, that you're compelled to your feet to cheer, and you don't even know what you're doing. But you enjoy it, that's for sure. And that enjoyment is also a sign of the depth and utility of that response. You see this in all the things that people do that are, you know, so-called popular entertainment. It's unbelievably sophisticated. The soul is participating in that in the fullest extent. And, you know, you can say, well, there's no necessary use for the religious terminology. It's like, well, until you come up with a better word, there's plenty of use for it, because it's a very complex and deep phenomena. And to, you know, just cast it into the realm of superstition in some casual manner it's just not helpful. Not in any possible. It's not helpful scientifically. It's not helpful ethically. It's not helpful existentially. Try treating someone for a while as if they don't have a soul. Just really, I mean it. Just, you know, treat them like a deterministic machine, if that's your belief. Really act it out. You'll be like the most hated person in town in about 15 minutes. Well, I mean, what do you make of practical evidence like that? I mean, you interact with people as if they're free souls capable of choosing between good and evil. That's what you do all the time. And maybe you can addle yourself out of that by some ridiculous rationalist ideology, but that just means you're kind of a gabbling fool, and it's just going to make you trip over things you don't even notice in all of your social interactions. I don't care how you think philosophically or ideologically, you bloody well know that what I just said is true. So, and that's true even when you're interacting with an infant or a small child. It's true when you're dealing with someone who's elderly and virtually incapacitated in every way. You still see that divine spark, for lack of a better term, and we do lack a better term, by the way. You see that everywhere if your eyes are open and if you're willing to see it, and to the degree that you're responsive to that, then your actions are guided by love and your words are guided by truth. When I was 25 or so, I probably weighed about 138 pounds. I smoked like a pack of cigarettes a day. I drank tremendous amount of alcohol. I was from northern Alberta, this rough little town up in northern Alberta called Fairview, and you know, there were long winters there, and my friends were heavy drinkers, and most of them dropped out of school by the time they were 15 or 16, went off to work on the oil rigs, and you know, it was a rough town, and we drank a lot. I started when I was 14, and you know, and so I had a lot of bad habits, let's say, and things that were, and I wasn't in great shape physically, and I was also still intellectually obsessed by, as I am now, and so that would have been in '85. But when I
But I decided around then, about 85, 84, something like that, maybe a little earlier, that I was really going to try to get my act together. And so I started doing that. First of all, I quit smoking. Well, that took a long time because I eventually had to quit drinking too in order to quit smoking. And I started working out, started playing sports, which I'd never done. I was a small kid. I'd been skipped a grade, and I was small for my age. So sports were never, especially team sports, were never really a domain of expertise for me. Although I skied and went trapping with my dad, went, cross-country skiing and camping and all that. So, but when I went to graduate school, I started swimming. The first physical exercise routine I did, I enrolled in a swimsercise course, I think it was called. So it was me and this like really overweight kid, and like these 60-year-old women and men, they could out exercise me like mad. It was really embarrassing. Me and the overweight kid, we'd be just panting ourselves 3/4 to death at the end of the bloody workout, and these 60-year-old women who weren't in great shape were like, chatting away as if nothing was going on at all in the pool. So that was quite embarrassing, and as was going to the weight room, because when I started I could barely bench press 75 pounds, and people used to keep coming over and helping me, which was the last thing I bloody well wanted, but certainly needed. And I got to the point where I could bench press 225 pounds. I think that was the best I did, and I gained about 30 pounds of muscle in a year and a half. So that was a good thing. So like I was kind of a wild man, and I'm a little bit manic in my temperament, and so I was kind of going every direction at the same time. So, and I don't regret that. I had a fine time when I was a kid, but I needed really to get disciplined, and I had to do it because I was working on these hard problems that that I've been discussing with all of you, and I've been working on them really obsessively since I was probably about 18, maybe even earlier than that. Got to the point around 25 when I was in graduate school trying to get my PhD, doing all my research. Like I published 15 papers by the time I graduated with my PhD, which was I think by a fairly large measure the most papers that any graduate student at that time had ever published at McGill. I think that's right. It might have been twice as many, or maybe twice as many, maybe even 3 times as many. And at the same time I wrote Maps of Meaning, which was a terribly difficult thing to do, because I was writing about 3 hours a day doing that, and I couldn't do all that and continue with my misbehavior, my sort of what would you say, my massive hedonistic consumption of alcohol and all of that. I just couldn't keep it up and also work seriously on the issues that were at hand. So I had to stop. That's a sacrifice. I had to stop messing about and straighten myself out. And I got married. Well, the woman who's my wife, Tammy, who I've known since she was 8 years old, she lived across the street from me in this little town called Fairview, and I was in love with her like the first time I saw her, which is quite the bloody thing. So that's worked out pretty well for me. But she came to live with me about the same time, and we decided jointly to get our act together, and we swore that we'd tell each other the truth, which I think she's actually done better than me. Like I don't think she's lied to me ever in our entire marriage, which is unbelievable, and it's been so useful because I can really tell her things and we can really talk. So I tell you, if you want to have a good relationship, man, you embed it in the truth, because if you don't embed it in the truth, you don't have a relationship. It's just lies. It's a tissue of lies, and it will dissolve in the chaos as soon as a crisis comes along. So the truth is a terrible thing, but not compared to falsehood. So we should make a very clear distinction here, that often when people are embittered and resentful and feel like they're victims, it's because really awful things have happened to them. Now, not always, but often. And so then the question is, well, if you're in a situation and something really awful is happened to you or has happened to you, then, well, why shouldn't you feel like a victim? And is there a better alternative? And part of what you were trying to lay out in this part of the book is what those better alternatives are. So part of looking for that hero is to find out from someone else's example. In your case, it was your mother, but these other sources that you described, of people who were in a sort of hell in an undeniable sense, but who chose in a very real way to make it as good as it could possibly be given the circumstances. And so they had to turn to
sources of power, let's say, and strength and fortitude and resilience that weren't, in some sense, obviously associated with the catastrophe. I mean, in your mother's case, it's a pretty tragic situation. She's a young mother, she has young kids, now she has breast cancer, and she fights a losing battle over a period of 5 years. That's pretty bad. And then you have to ask yourself, given that that's obviously pretty bad, how is it even possible that someone could handle that with not only grace and courage, but the kind of grace and courage that leaves their children with an immovable sense of the ability to prevail in the face of the deepest adversity. I mean, that's really something. You said here, thousands have come before you and they did just fine. So quit your complaining. And it's not because you have nothing to complain about. That's not the case. It's that that's not the right approach. The fact is, and this is such an optimistic fact, as well as a judgment in some sense, the fact is that if someone else can do it, so can you. And that's something, right? If you're reading about the great heroes in history, people who are in these terrible situations, and you see someone rise to the occasion, and then you can say, well, that was a person who did that, and I'm a person, and so maybe I have that capacity too, even though I don't know how to approach it. And then some of the rest of your book, much of the rest of your book, I would say in some sense is a guide to help people figure out how they could approach that. One of the things you point out first is, well, notice who you admire. And then maybe try consciously practicing becoming like that.